understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time. I am talking to John, who is holed up in the Pyrenees. He's not quite wearing a bandage over his right ear, but he is upset at the goings on in America. And we will talk about America in due course. Ça va, ma poule? How is France?
France is wonderful. France is burning up. It is 35 degrees here, and I'm in the mountains. And Jesus, it's amazing out here. Brilliant walks. Just the French life is just fab.
Are you going to come home?
I'm not sure. I'm contemplating that now.
We should call the podcast Le Pod after this, okay? If you stay there, we could do it. You know, we could actually do a sort of multilingual global podcast, l'Irlande, contre le français, all that sort of carry on.
As long as we don't have a Microsoft outage.
Yes. Well, that's another thing. Actually, on the Microsoft outage, right, what that reveals to all of us is just how unbelievably fragile the global economy is.
Absolutely.
How unbelievably interlinked, enmeshed, entwined, interdependent. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. And this is why when I hear all our friends in America, our MAGA friends, because I know this has been exercising you, we're going to talk about them not just now, we're going to talk about them probably next podcast. But when I hear about them talking about isolationism and America pulling out from the world, I kind of think, do you know what that means? Do you actually know what that means? Do you actually know what that entails? You know, I mean, it sounds great. And of course, it's going to be a massively dominant part of the discourse over the next 6 or 8 months. But this idea of America first means that they will have to rely on American technology. They'll have to rely on American consumer goods, American cars, it's going to take them a long, long time to produce consumer goods anywhere close to the Asians. So just wait until those MAGA hats go from $15 a hat to $48 a hat because they're all being made in America. And just
$48.99.
Yeah, see how they feel about that. But anyway, John, look, it is great to see you because I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks and I've missed you, obviously. And,
indeed, likewise, Mac.
I am back. Well, I'm here in the rain and nothing changes. I was actually in the mountains of Mourne yesterday in a little place called Killinchy up in the north. And I was having lovely spot on the Ards Peninsula, right? So just past the mountains of Mourne on the way up to Newton Ards. Very, very nice part of the world. I don't know if you ever saw the movie December Bride.
Not sure.
It was shot early 90s, but it was shot all around this sort of the farmlands around the Ards Peninsula. But it was 14 degrees. 14.
Compared to my 35.
Exactly. So listen, you can take your 35 and shove it up your jacksie. We're happy enough with 14 to 20 degrees. Anyway, What I want to talk about, John, is a plan for Ireland. What happened when you've been away last week, the CSO. So we're talking about the official statistics office of the country, not some sort of, blog or some sort of, Facebook post. We're talking about the people who make the actual forecasts for this country. They came out and they said, we will have a population, or we could have, not we will, we could have a population of 7.5 million by 2057. Now, you might remember we did a podcast called the 10 Million Mindset.
Yes.
Yeah. And the idea was that, on present calculations, the population of this island could go to 10 million by, let's say, the end of the century. So by 2100. Now, what these guys are saying is the population of the Republic could go to 7.5 million by 2057. You throw in the 2 million Nordies, you're close to 9.5 million. You're almost there.
Yes.
Not within a century, within half a century. So the idea was, okay, that's all very well, but let's think about it, right? It seems like a long, long time away, right? 2027. It's like 33 years away, okay? At the age of Christ, John, just to be biblical about the whole thing, right? But if you think about it, that's not that long ago, because in our lifetime, right? 33 years ago is 1991. 1991 is the year that Axon Baby is released.
Yeah, it's like yesterday.
It's the year the REM single Shiny Happy People topped the charts.
Yeah.
the year that Jack Charlton was going to walk in among us as a soccer god. Okay?
Yeah.
It's the year, bizarrely, and this is an amazing thing. For the younger generation, you won't know this. For the very first time, condoms went on sale in the Dublin Virgin Megastore.
God, yeah, I remember that. I remember that well.
Yeah, you were nervous going in to get them.
Yeah. You kind of
How'd you be
shuffled
caught?
in sideways.
Exactly. Right?
But then
This
you
is
didn't
more-
even have a girlfriend.
Exactly. You just kind of blew them up and see what happens, right? Draw little smiley faces on them.
Yeah.
But, what I'm saying is, right, this is not a long time hence. It's 33 years. If you're 20, it seems like an eternity because it is. But if you're older, you can understand that time goes very, very quickly. And what they're saying is the population will increase or could increase to this level. And that this is the key, John. 90% of the increase in the population will be due to inward migration. And only 9% will be due to the natural increase, right? Now, the natural increase is basically your births vis-a-vis your deaths, right?
Yeah,
The existing population, right? And what's happening is the natural increase is beginning to slow. Why? Because people are having less kids, but also the generation that was born, our generation, is beginning to die out. More of us are dying than are having kids. So
Yeah.
the natural increase in the population begins to fall. But the CSO have said this will be dramatically altered by the fact that 90% of this increase in population on an annual basis will come from net migration. Now, this means a massive economic, social, demographic, and cultural shift in the country. Massive.
Of course. Means more burning of houses and asylum centres. Like it really does.
Of Crown Paints factory. But if you come back to it, so I was looking at that thing and I was thinking, okay, so it's not that far away. The population increase is dramatic. Does the CSO tell us anything about where these people are going to live? But probably more importantly, what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But if you look at immigration, so immigration has two sides to it. It has what I would call the pull factors and the push factors. So the push factors are, what are those factors pushing these people out of their own countries into countries like Ireland? And when you say Ireland, we're talking Ireland, Britain. I mean, the British will say that there's a population, the British population increases by the size of Birmingham every single year because of immigration, right? So we're looking at something very, very similar. The push factors are, what are the factors pushing these people out of their countries? First one, you could talk about the climate there, John, right?
Yeah.
Climate change will mean that very large parts of Africa will be unlivable in very, very soon.
Yeah.
That's going to push people up. Poverty as well, war, conflict, etc., etc. All these factors push people to countries like Ireland, and we can do very, very little about that.
And also
right?
the exploding populations in the likes of, say, Nigeria, which is going to have, as you said before, the biggest population in Africa and a bigger population than Europe.
Well, the amazing fact is that there were more Nigerian kids born last year than kids who were born in the entire continent of Europe. So that gives you a sense of what's happening, right? So these people are going to be on the move. So they're the kinds of push factors of which we can do very, very little about. And then there's the pull factors of, why do we want people in here? Why do we pull talented people in here? Why do we pull immigrants in here? And then you're going to say, okay, well, if the CSO suggests that the pull factors are such that we will, increase the population by, 1.5 million in a very, very short period of time, maybe 2 million in a very short period of time, what plan are we basing this on? What are we going to do here? So what's the plan for Ireland? So I was just thinking to myself, John, what amazes me, right? I'll give you another statistic, right? The CSO has also said that by the year 2037, which is only 14 years from now, that the labour force could increase to as much as 3.3 million people. The labour force. Now, the labour force now is about 2 million. So that's about an increase of 1.3 million. That is the entire population of Greater Dublin. They think the labour force alone could increase by. So you think to yourself, what do they think these people are going to be doing, right?
Yeah.
And what is the plan to absorb these people? Because at the moment, what we're talking about, all we're talking about is we've got to build enough houses and we've got to build enough roads, and we've got to build rail and all that sort of stuff. All that we know. Then the question is, what is the economic or commercial plan for the country? in the event that all these people arrive in the country, or in the event that the country is requiring a massive increase in immigration. Because my assumption on the CSO is that the statisticians there are not doing a Anglo and plucking these figures out of their backside. That they've actually based on some, the CSO talks to the Department of Environment, it talks to the Department of Labor.
Sure.
It should be, as I've always said, countries with good statistics are very civilized. Countries with bad statistics are uncivilized. That statistics are actually one of the great acid tests of proper countries. Now, all countries therefore have to have a plan, and it all has to be based on a population increase. So this document that was published last week, which is kind of in the papers, people said, oh yeah, that's interesting, but didn't get enough. I don't think it got half enough attention, right? This is the foundational document of the development of Ireland for the next half century, right? Now it's as basic as that, right? So then you think, okay, how are we going to employ all these people? How are we going to make all these people economically active? How are we going to create a society that is sufficiently vibrant, that deals with immigration at a time when you can see anti-immigration feeling is rising and rising and rising?
Yeah.
And you think those sort of statistics coming from the CSO, I mean, that is manna from heaven for an anti-immigration nationalist party, because they'll just say, look, this is what the plan is.
Well, what I was going to say is that maybe there's a plan B, which is to stop immigration, full stop, which is going to be impossible because, I mean, Europe as a whole, immigration will be on a similar level, surely, as well, which will cause its own issues socially and economically.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that let's assume that the CSO has talked to the Department of the Taoiseach, and has talked to the Department of Finance, has talked to the Department of Integration, which is in effect the Department of Immigration, right? And they're all happy to go along with this idea that, you know what, this is what's going to happen in the country. These are the figures. This is what's happened. What they're saying is immigration is now about 77,000 per year. It'll drop off to 45,000 a year, but 45,000 a year into perpetuity, right?
Yeah.
So we say, okay, let's park the idea that there will be a political backlash, which there will be. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
And there will be a massive political backlash against asylum-seeking immigration. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, it's a fact, right? This is the biggest issue. And it's the one that's on people's frontal lobes rather than the back of your heads. It's actually real and it's everywhere now, right? But let's just think, if Ireland wants to develop in the next 50 years into a vibrant state or a more vibrant state, what is the plan?
Yeah.
And most people say, well, look, the only way we can have a vibrant economy that can absorb in people and can provide a living for us, the people who live here, and for our kids and for their kids, is if you have a vibrant private sector. And by that I mean you have a vibrant, small and medium-sized industrial complex, which is innovative, which is dynamic, which is outward-looking, and which has to be the best in Europe in terms of being able to compete, or the best in the world in terms of able to compete. And then you look and say, okay, well, what's the situation right now? The situation right now, John, is we have two economies. We have basically operating in parallel. We have the high productivity, high profit multinational economy.
Yeah.
And we have the low productivity, low profit local economy. And what is happening in Ireland, the big risk in Ireland, is that you end up having just multinationals throwing off tax revenue, which creates a bigger state, i.e. a bigger public sector, and what I would call public sector adjacent companies. Companies like, for example, Ernst & Young and these companies, which are basically in effect part of the public sector. Their major contracts come from the public sector. So basically what you have is a very, very large multinational sector, a very large public sector, and what I would call professional sectors associated with that. And then you have retail, and that's it. And you don't have any actual manufacturing base.
And then who are the low productivity guys then?
So the low productivity guys here are retail, hospitality, Irish companies that are basically in construction, these sort of companies.
Yeah.
Which are very, very low productivity, low profit. So it's basically the domestic sector.
And,
right?
and how is it, just before you go on there, how is that measured? Because is that measured purely on profit and profit margin? Because obviously the high tech companies, pharma, et cetera, are going to have much higher profit margins than like your corner shop or your cafe or your builder.
Well, let's just start. So productivity is the basis of all economic growth.
Yeah.
Because productivity is output per head. So basically what you do is you divide the output of different companies, how much they produce, by the amount of people who work there, right? And what you see is that productivity in the economy in general, the productivity in Ireland in general is 97 euros 10 per hour, which means that every employee in this country produces 97 euros 10 cent per hour, which is a phenomenally high productivity rate.
Yeah.
That masks a massive gap, which is that in the foreign sector, i.e. in the multinational sector, output per head per hour is 381 euros.
Okay.
Compared to 53 euros in the domestic sector.
Wow. Okay.
So basically, what you're looking at is a gap around 7 or 8 times. The multinationals are at 7 or 8 times more productive per employee per hour than the local companies. And the reason for that is they're incredibly capital intensive, number one, and they have much, much better management structures, number two. So they have much, much better way of managing their workforces. They're very, very capital intensive, and what I would call they have American or foreign know-how when it comes to production.
Yeah.
Our guys, the local guys, are falling very, very far behind. And as I've said before, if it wasn't for the multinationals, we would have exactly the same problems as Britain, which is low productivity, current account problems, budget deficit problems, all those problems, right? But because of the multinationals, we don't have those issues.
But is part of that like an education or training issue where, in terms of running companies and in terms of company structures? And if it is, why can't we just mimic the multinationals?
Because it's really very hard. So there's a sort of a kind of a bizarre idea in Ireland that the education system produces highly skilled workers.
Yeah.
That's a complete misunderstanding of how the thing works. The education system produces workers and they are made highly skilled by moving into the multinational companies. So it's the training on the job in the multinational companies that makes the difference between an Irish engineer and an Irish engineer working for Intel. And it's the training they get in Intel. It's the specialized mechanistic training. It's the access to capital. It's the access to ideas. It's the access to management structures. It's all those things. So those workers are made incredibly productive by basically joining the multinational sector. They're not productive before they join it. They've got the base intelligence or the base competence.
Sure.
So that is incredibly difficult to do because it requires massive capital base, which is what the Irish local companies don't have. So what we have is this dilemma. If, for example, John, you get this level of migration and you don't increase productivity across the board, what you're going to do is you're going to get a collapse in real wages.
Okay.
Because you cannot have more workers unless you have more output. And unless you have more output, if you have more workers, real wages have to fall. Now, if real wages fall at a time when migration is very, very high, we're going to have social chaos completely. At the moment, migration is very, very high, but real wages are rising. And real wages have been rising for the last 20 years in Ireland. But you can imagine immigration at a time of a very stagnant economy, and you will get social, political, cultural chaos across the board.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, you won't be able to generate income. You won't be able to generate tax revenue.
Yes.
You won't be able to generate the tax revenue necessary to pay for the increases in education, in health, in housing, all those things that the state needs to provide, let's say, over the next 20 or 25 years. So then the question is, okay, well, what is the commercial plan? Because without a commercial plan, these population numbers are meaningless, but where they are meaningful is in the political implication they will have, which is kind of horrendous.
Yes. Yeah.
We've already seen that. So then we think, okay, what's the plan? And it strikes me that there is no plan. I've looked around, I've spoken to political advisors, I've looked through many, many documents that have been published all the time by the Irish economic fraternity.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking there's absolutely no plan to do the following, which is to bridge the gap between multinationals and local companies.
And what's the response, though, from the likes of political advisors when you ask that question?
They're not thinking about it. They don't think about it. What they think about is the next 2 or 3 months, right?
Yeah.
It's an election cycle. It's a by-election cycle. It's something like Brexit. How do we react to that? It's always reactive. But there is one thing that Ireland has done amazingly well, which is we've created this inward investment model. Really better than anywhere else, I would say, certainly in the Western world. Maybe 1 or 2 developing countries are in on the act, but in the Western world, we've done this one thing, the inward investment, better than almost anyone. So the question is there a way of creating an economic model that is based on what we have and exists in the country, but that leverages off the multinationals?
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is you could conceive of a plan. There is a plan that could work here that could be absolutely transformational for the entire society, which is based on using the existing multinationals as your anchor tenant in a way.
Yeah.
And creating an adjacent economy or a parallel economy which bridges the gap between the productivity in the local economy right now, which is very, very low, and the productivity in the multinational economy, which is very, very high. And there is a way of doing this.
Well, let's dig into that. Let's explore that a little bit more after a bit of this.
Great. It's optimistic, John. It's upbeat. It's all about the possibilities.
Isn't it always? So, Mark, what we're talking about here is a fast-growing population that we're going to hit perhaps on an island-wide basis, 10 million people. And the big question is, how are we going to deal with that? What's the plan? What are they going to be doing? What are they going to be working on?
Right, this is the whole thing. What are they going to do? You know, you cannot conceive of this amount of people without conceiving of a totally different economic structure. So basically, it's highly irresponsible to put out these sort of forecasts about population at a time when people are worried about immigration without saying, and we have a plan to deal with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what they're doing in Ireland is they're putting out these figures, scaring the bejesus out of people, and no joined up thinking, which is we're putting out this population forecast, and here's how we're going to deal with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So we are going to tell them how to deal with it.
Of course.
No, but seriously, because I've thought, you know, the way I think about these things all the time, like how does the economy work? And what the economy needs to have is what I call a closed circuit, if at all possible.
Yeah.
How do we create an entrepreneurial culture? Because the only way in which a high migration culture can work is if people pay their own way.
Yeah.
If they're not dependent, if they're actually generating their own income, their own profits, their own innovation. The absolute disaster would be to have a high immigration and sometimes therefore goes with this idea of a low trust economy. So that's another idea. And say, well, don't worry, the multinationals will drag us all up, because that's when the discussion of what if they leave becomes really material and kind of terrifying. So the idea here was to say, okay, well, how do you create an new entrepreneurial parallel economy? And what you need is money, and what you need is markets to create new companies, right? So you can't create a new company without a market, and you can't create access to that market without money to get there.
Yeah.
So the first thing is the multinational presence can answer both of these questions, right? The first one is the money, and we've spoken about this before. And this is the idea that all the tax that the multinationals throw off, a proportion of it is now going into the sovereign wealth fund that we articulated about 4 or 5 years, about 4 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But it's all going into this idea of the pension fund. How will we pay for people as we get older? The fascinating thing about these CSO figures is to say the population is going to get younger, right?
Yes.
Which is, again, no joined up thinking again. So you've got a sovereign wealth fund for a population that's going to be materially younger, which is kind of bizarre, right?
Yes,
Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, as I've always thought, what Ireland doesn't need so much is a pension fund as a startup fund, or at least a proportion of the tax revenue that has been thrown off by the multinationals should be used to seed startup companies, these new companies, right? And why do you need that? Is because new companies need to be de-risked, okay? Because new companies go to the wall all the time. And so who is going to finance these new companies? Well, you want the banking system to finance these new companies. Why? Because Ireland has an enormous 130 billion sitting on deposit. And the banks in Ireland, as we've talked about before, are no longer feeding credit into the economy on a commercial basis. They've basically, in effect, become safety deposit boxes for the middle classes.
Right.
They're safe deposit boxes for the middle classes. And the way they're making their money is not by aggressive lending, as we know. The way they're making their money is by actually skimming off the top of people's deposits and taking that as profits. So they're not passing on the increases in interest rates to the depositors. So Irish money is going into the banks and it's getting stuck. At the same time, we don't have an enthusiastic and vibrant startup financing culture. And at the same time, we have loads of money going into a pension fund, whereas we actually need startup money. So the money idea we've talked about before would be to do the following. Every single citizen gets a little piece of this sovereign wealth fund. And that sovereign wealth fund is in the guise of the shares of high productivity companies, which we all know about, right? So what you could do is you could give, let's say, John Davis, his 10 grand of the sovereign wealth fund, and he could go to Bank of Ireland and say, I have a podcasting producing idea and I would like you to back me. And Bank of Ireland say, well, what do you have? And you'd say, well, I don't really have anything else except I've got 10 grand from these shares. And Bank of Ireland say, well, fine, we will take that collateral. We will give you 10 grand. We therefore have liquid collateral. You have your idea and your financing, and we have de-risked the entire thing. Now, if you do this across the board, what you would do is you would create an extraordinary, vibrant startup, almost like venture capital infrastructure or ecosystem, right? And therefore, you would have a startup fund. So that's the money side of things, because we're not talking about all big companies start small. So we're talking about small amounts of money initially. And given the size of the sovereign wealth fund, this could easily be used as a pledge for collateral for small companies. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing you think is, okay, well, what about the market? Ireland is too small for companies to get big quickly. That's the idea of scale. If you are a small country, you are dictated by what I call the tyranny of size. You just don't have a big enough market. So therefore, the answer always is, well, therefore, we've got to create exporting companies that export to Germany and Japan and America and all that sort of stuff, right? But exporting is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. And this is all because of the fundamental rule in economics, which is geography matters. You trade with people beside yourselves. And the further away you go from your country, the less likely you are to have a foothold in their economy, either culturally or materially or commercially, because it's just too far away. So you trade with people beside yourselves. So you say, okay, well, that means trading, with countries like Britain, Germany, and Belgium and all these sort of things. You say, no, think about the multinationals. The multinationals, you could envisage them, because they're so big, as small countries in themselves. So you imagine you export to them, but they're right beside you. So then you think, okay, well, what are we talking about? What we're talking about is the multinationals have a massive procurement bill, right? They procure, they buy. So rather than see the multinationals as taxpayers and producers alone, why not see them as customers? They could be the customers of this new Irish dynamic sector that we basically supply to them. So what the state could do very easily is go to the large multinationals and say, can we talk to your procurement people? And they'd say, yeah, sure. And say, well, what do you buy? And where are you buying it from? And then you can imagine the sort of things they could buy from us, right?
But does this not happen already? I can't imagine that it doesn't.
It doesn't happen on a systematic basis. So the idea would be you export to the multinationals who are exporters, rather than you export to a country miles away and you hope to get a toehold there. you export to the multinationals. Now, it does happen on a market basis, but this is to happen on a systematic basis. You say to them, look, what we would like you to do, right? And you sit down with them and you have like a whole partnership with them. You say, you're here, you're doing extremely well. It's working very, very well for you. But we would like you to procure more from local companies. And they'd say, well, that's all very well, but your local companies don't exist at the moment.
Yeah.
We do that, sure, right? And we will say, well, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to try and build this local infrastructure. And they will say, fine, okay, well, we don't compel them. You can't compel them to buy, but you might say, look, down the road, maybe some of that sort of tax that you get here, why don't we link some of that, not to employment, but to procurement from companies? And what you do is you create a demand for new Irish companies within Ireland. But that demand has the vibrancy of a massive export market. Why? Because you're exporting to Intel, you're exporting to Pfizer, you're exporting to Google, you're exporting to all these large companies, you're exporting to Eli Lilly, but you're doing it from the village next door, the
Yes.
town next door. And that sort of idea is you open up their procurement side so that you create what I would call this closed circuit economy. So the multinationals export out of Ireland, and these new Irish companies export into the multinationals. So as the multinationals grow, so do the local economies grow. And what you're doing is you're creating the basis for a vibrant, savvy, adventurous local economy, which is leveraging off everything that the multinationals have built.
And is there an example of this? That is,
No.
No. Globally, there's none.
No, but if you look at, for example, South Korea, South Korea built their economy, and South Korea is the most impressive country, I think, in the world, both culturally, economically, politically. What they've done is they have created, in half a century, they have gone from having the GDP of Mali to having the most dynamic, probably the most dynamic economy in Asia, which is the most dynamic part of the world. Right? So what they've done is they've created something like this, where the whole supply chain is integrated. So what I'm talking about is doing the same thing, creating an integrated supply chain. At the moment in Ireland, we produce graduates, and those graduates go into the multinationals. They get jobs, they get higher wages because they have higher productivity. The multinationals pay taxes. Those taxes go to pay our public sector and pay all sorts of things, right? But we're leaving out half of the opportunity. The half of the opportunity is supply chains into the multinationals, right? And this has to be done on a systematic basis. There's no point. The interesting thing about South Korea, right, is it developed, like all of Asia, not on a free market basis. It was actually orchestrated from the top. So if you talk, this is the fascinating thing. There is nothing in the Asian development model that has not been the idea. There's nothing in the Asian development model that hasn't been orchestrated from the top, right? That's the fascinating thing.
Yeah.
They figured the whole thing. So in South Korea, there's a thing called chaebols, which were their very, very large companies that they built. Japan, the same thing, there's a thing called MITI, which was basically essentially seeded companies after the Second World War. And it just strikes me that Ireland has a brilliant opportunity to create a parallel, innovative, small business sector, which is highly productive. Now, you said to me, John, why don't we just learn and mimic the multinationals?
Yes.
Because it's incredibly difficult to do. And how the only way you do it is through hard work. And the only way you do it is through actually coming up with the products that are sufficiently good for them to buy from you. That is the requirement. So what you're doing is you're actually saying to the multinationals, okay, what is the standard you need to buy from us?
Yeah.
And they'll say X, Y, Z. And we say, okay, we're going to try and get there in the next 10 years. So rather than seeing the gap in productivity as a chasm and a threat, you see it as a target.
Yeah.
And the way in which you mimic people and the way in which you grow economically and the way in which you grow commercially is through hard work and trial and error and making mistakes and all that sort of stuff, which is why you need the banks to seed the capital. But the banks won't seed the capital because the risk is too big, which is why you need to de-risk the original investment, which is why you need the startup fund. So it's basically you've got the startup fund is working to create the financial ability for the companies to export to the multinationals. And in that way, you can close. It's like being an electrician, John. It's like a closed circuit economy,
yeah.
right? That everything works in tandem and everything works together. And the idea is you generate a local, vibrant domestic economy which sits adjacent to, not parallel to, but adjacent to, so it fits in with the multinational sector, and you leverage the entire thing, and you move together, and you kind of jump together. And it will take about 10 years to do, but it could be done. And not only could it be done, it has to be done.
Yeah.
Because if we, and I come back to this idea, if we absorb in this amount of people without an economic plan that is designed to increase real wages, we will get falls in wages, which will create social tensions, which will create the entire platform for a very, very nasty nationalist party. And that party will be entirely legitimate because the grievances will be legitimate.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? So, you said, is there no plan? There could be a plan, but it requires those people who sit and advise the state and think about it to actually be thinking along these lines. And when I see the CSO publishing figures like this last week, without a document which says, and by the way, if you're interested in these figures, how we're going to create the economy that is necessary to sustain these figures, and here's our plan, that makes me worried.
Yeah.
Because that's what people naturally think, well, how can we square this circle? So it's all, John, we will conclude, it's all about joined up thinking, right? Taking what you have, making the best of it, creating a new economy, but not reinventing the wheel, just doing what's obviously in front of you. The multinationals are customers. That's the key. And they are customers to new businesses. And those new businesses have yet to be created, but could be created, and create what I call this closed circuit economy, which is the only way that we can actually make these population forecasts work. Otherwise, it's going to be social chaos.